Why don't we get started? I wanted to give folks just a few extra minutes to trickle in. I think all of our presenters are here now, and we have a good amount of attendees. So why don't we get started? I just want to start out by introducing myself. So I'm Josh Bowers with Fair Share Housing Center, one of the members of the board of directors here with the Affordable Housing Professionals of New Jersey, and we're really excited for this panel this morning. It's a panel to talk about, as you know, the Fair Chance in Housing Act, which was passed into law and signed by the governor last year on Juneteenth. One of the furthest reaching, housing justice bills that has been passed, especially in New Jersey and perhaps even nationwide. It's the first sort of ban the box for housing that applies across an entire state, as far as I know, in the entire country. And we're here today to talk about that. And just at the outset, I just want to thank the AHP&J for hosting this, and particularly Lindsay Britt for putting together really doing a lot of the legwork for organizing the Zoom, and the program committee for really getting the ball rolling with getting this panel going. We have a few really excellent presenters today. Thankfully for you guys, I am mostly just doing introductions, and I'm going to sit back and sort of become part of the audience as we go along. I think we have really two excellent presenters. My colleague James Williams from Fair Share Housing Center. He's our Director of Racial Justice Policy. I sadly don't get to see James speak very, very often, because we're often in different corners of the state, doing our different work. So it's really going to be a treat for me this morning to get to hear what James has to say about the bill. And James is going to talk about, I think, a lot of the history, really the necessity of the bill, and then also the history and how the bill came about, some of the organizing that went into it. And then we have also with us is Iris Bromberg from the Division on Civil Rights, who is the entity that's going to be primarily responsible for really enforcing the bill, has adopted regulations about the bill, and is going to really do a deep dive into how the whole thing works, any exceptions to the bill, all that sort of stuff, lots of best practices, and really how it all applies. So what I would like to do now is we're going to turn it over to James first. I know James has a PowerPoint. I don't know, James, if you're in a place where you can share that, or if you want me to, I can share it as well if you need me to. I downloaded it onto my computer, so whatever. And the same goes for you, Iris. I think you had a PowerPoint as well, so I'd be happy to help out and share that if that's helpful.
Good morning. Thanks, Josh. I'm happy to, one second, share it on my end once I figure out why I didn't download. Here we go. Sorry. Here we are. Presentation mode. So I bring it up. There we go. All right, let's share the screen. All right, is everyone able to see the presentation?
I can see it, James. Yeah, it looks good.
All right, perfect. So, good morning, everyone. I'm James Williams. I'm the Director of Racial Justice Policy here at Fair Share Housing Center, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you guys this morning. So, I'll try my best so that Iris and I don't have too much overlap. And I first want to thank Iris and her team at DCR for being such an amazing partner. Not too often do you have a state agency that is as invested as advocates are in a singular piece of legislation. So it was refreshing. It almost seemed unnormal to have a partner that put the kind of legwork into this piece of legislation as DCR did. So thank you, Iris. Not here today. Her director, Rachel Wayner-Apter, was an amazing champion for this bill. Derek Fisher, who's now with the governor's office, Aaron Scherzer, who moved on to another opportunity, Aaron Williams. So I'm saying all these thank yous because I really want everyone here to know that this, though Fair Share has received a tremendous amount of quote unquote credit for this piece of legislation from a advocate standpoint, this would not have been possible without Division on Civil Rights and their willingness to participate. So this historic piece of legislation, as you can see, was signed on Juneteenth. Directly over Governor Murphy's shoulder is our Deputy Director, Reverend Eric Dobson, and a laundry list of legislators and advocates that helped us to really work and get this to the finish line. So it was fitting that this piece of legislation that actually looked to address an issue that particularly affected Black and Brown communities was signed on this historic day. And this was our state's first year actually celebrating Juneteenth. And why is it so important to Black and Brown communities, and why is it so important to housing as a whole? This was such an intersectional bill as it touched on housing, civil rights, social justice, and because of COVID-19, it actually helped to address health and human safety. But in Jersey, we unfortunately lead the nation in racial disparities for Black to white incarceration for both adult and youth. So this bill really tackled housing and reentry and looked to decouple those two fundamental rights in an essential way. These are some of our coalition partners. Once again, these are the advocates that helped us to get this through the finish line. Unlisted are Division on Civil Rights. And I'd also like to say that, the governor's office was very, very pivotal in ensuring that this bill got done. Protections for returning citizens. So this new law, known as Ban the Box, prohibits landlords from running criminal background checks before a conditional offer can be made. I'm going to be very high level because Iris will do a great job of diving into the enforcement and those components. But as Josh alluded to, this is the first one of its kind that has the kind of fundamental protections that we're offering here in the state of New Jersey. There are other states that have quote unquote housing ban the box laws on the books, but none that have the kind of comprehensive protection that we are able to offer here in the state of New Jersey. None are being enforced by the Division on Civil Rights. None are being supported by the Attorney General's office. So we have a tiered look-back system, a very unique look-back system that actually looks to address the severities in different types of crimes. So 6, 4-year, and 1 year look back. Once again, Iris will probably allude to a lot of the more nuanced pieces of the bill, but this is a unique component that we thought could provide equity in the types of different crimes that individuals may have committed. We would have loved to have a universal singular look back period, but this we thought provided an opportunity for not only landlords and developers to have the peace of mind as it pertains to crimes that they may be, that are deemed more serious and need more scrutiny as opposed to low-level offenses. Enforcement, as I alluded to, our partners at Division on Civil Rights. I won't touch on their piece. Iris will really dive into that and really talk about how they add some much wanted teeth to this bill. And if you guys didn't get the notification, I think last week or the week before, the Attorney General's office, in conjunction with the Division of Civil Rights, launched investigations into 7 landlords and developers that were publicly promoting units that you could not have a criminal background check. So I want to thank them for already being a part of the work. We created a Know Your Rights. This is what we think to be a no-nonsense way of addressing the bill. A lot of people, this is a very nuanced bill. It has a lot of language, a lot of niche kind of things that's not everyone will be familiar with. So we wanted to kind of create some Know Your Rights. Landlords can't ask. You shouldn't allude to your things. You can't be required to self-disclose. Even after a landlord makes a conditional offer, you do not need to disclose. Landlords are to ask about certain actions after convictions. And these are just some of the other components that we thought were really helpful in providing individuals on a day-to-day basis. We're thinking about an individual that's returning home. And I'm biased, I'm a housing advocate, but you ask anyone that works in the reentry space or anyone that is trying to make themselves whole, doesn't have to be a returning citizen, anyone that is trying to start their life anew, and housing will be at the epicenter of any kind of progress that they're trying to make. Before employment, before services, it has to be housing. That house is where you fill out that job application. That house is where you'll return home and take care of your children. So that house has to be at the epicenter, because an individual that has a job without a house, it's very difficult to get up to go to work if you're sleeping under an underpass, or if you're sleeping in a couch, or you're bouncing around from family member to family member. But if I give you stable and secure housing, everything else from there can begin to blossom. This seems like Iris's presentation, because I keep alluding to her for everything, but Iris will do a great job of kind of unpacking all the protections and regulatory language that they were able to put in there to ensure that, once again, this becomes, hopefully, in our estimation, one of the strongest housing discrimination bills that we have in the country. We say it's the first of our kind because of our partnership with Division of Civil Rights. I can't highlight that enough, that they are willing and eager and ready to accept phone calls and provide real-time assistance on not only returning citizens, but landlords and developers that have questions about this bill. What can I ask? What crime should I be looking for? To ask a landlord or developer to be an expert on criminal backgrounds is extremely unfair. So having a resource like that says, okay, this individual had a charge 10 years ago, this is the type of crime, how far can I look back? We'd love for individuals to start to utilize them to get that real information, so that they can make the best and most informed decision as possible. Because our goal isn't to just have a bunch of a huge pile of complaints. Our goal is to provide access to housing. So it's not to create fines, but it's actually to create access to housing. So from my standpoint, these are some of the other community partners that worked on it that are always, that in our estimation, are knowledgeable enough to provide assistance if you should need it. ACLU, Legal Services of New Jersey, Citizens Action, Housing and Community Development Network. And from there, once again, I am supposed to be the short version of the presentation, so that Iris can give you the meat and potatoes of it. I'm just the appetizer. So thank you guys for indulging me, and I will hand it back over to Josh.
Thank you, James. Before we get started with Iris, I think in order for us to get the credits that we need for the CLEs and whatever other continuing education stuff, I think we need to we need to do one of the question and answers. So I think Lindsay's okay. There we go.
It's okay for you to keep going while the question's up. I'll end the poll in about a minute.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, James. It was a great introduction to the bill and to the framework that we're all going to be working under for the next, well, into the future. And so what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Iris, who's going to really dig into the different requirements and the protections that this bill offers. And I think Iris has her own PowerPoint, so I will let her share that at this point.
Great, thank you so much. I'm having slight tech issues and we're going to work it out, so just bear with me for a second. But I first want to just thank you, James. Thank you, Fair Share. It's always lovely to join you all, and you always kind of frame the larger picture in such a helpful way. Okay, I'm going to try to share this now.
Sorry, I just wanted to also mention that the nature of the polls on Zoom means that the correct answer is not shared. So if you'd like people to know what the correct answer to this poll was, and each of the subsequent polls, you'll want to share that.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm planning on it.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you see my screen now? The PowerPoint?
Yes.
Wow, look at that. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you again. As you heard, the Fair Chance in Housing Act took effect on January 1st. It's the first state law of its kind, and it's intended to ensure people with past criminal histories have a fair shot at accessing safe and affordable housing. You know, as James discussed, this is such an important issue because it impacts so many people. And I will touch on some of those things briefly. The answer to that question is that 1 out of 3 people has a criminal history background. That's 77 million folks. And that's about the equivalent of how many people have a college degree. That number is, you know, really significant and means that this impacts a whole lot of us. We know that certain people of certain marginalized experiences are harmed more by over-incarceration and policing, like Black people and people of color. And this also implicates everyone. 1 out of 3 is a lot of people. So as you heard, my name is Iris Bromberg. I'm a legal specialist at the Division on Civil Rights, where I work in the Strategic Enforcement and Initiatives Unit. I like to first just generally get into what DCR is, and then we'll go over our agenda for the rest of the program. I promise you we'll get into all the nuts and bolts that you all are here for. So the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, I'm going to call us DCR for short. It's a state agency charged with enforcing New Jersey civil rights laws, the New Jersey Family Leave Act, and this new law, the Fair Chance in Housing Act. Our mission is to protect folks in New Jersey from discrimination and bias-based harassment in employment, housing, places of public accommodation. So to do this, we have both what we call proactive and reactive units. So we have one unit that just handles complaints. So if you believe you experience discrimination, or if you believe that your rights under the Fair Chance in Housing Act are violated, you could just file an individualized complaint with us. That's one way to handle it. But we also have proactive units. So my unit, the Strategic Initiatives Enforcement Unit, we try to think expansively about ways to combat discrimination. We draft regulations and guidance, which you heard some on. We issue reports in conjunction with the Fair Chance in Housing Act. We have put together a lot of materials to help folks go through this law, understand their obligations, understand their protections, and we will cover some of those today. They're all available on our website. And we also undertake director-initiated investigations into possible patterns and practices that violate civil rights. So I just wanted to hit on 2 more units because it may be relevant to you all. We have a community relations unit that engages in education and inclusive community engagement. They will often work directly with impacted communities after a civil rights incident has occurred. And we also lastly have an education and training unit. They provide extremely comprehensive and detailed interactive programming around all of the areas that we work on. There is a 90-minute, extremely detailed Fair Chance and Housing Act program. This presentation, I based largely on the presentation that we made there. In order to save time, I shorten it, but I highly encourage everyone to sign up. Those are free trainings if you have any more questions. So, okay, this is my disclaimer. Of course, I'm a lawyer. So this training includes legal information. My hope is that it's going to help you deepen your understanding. This should not be taken as legal advice or agency guidance or anything more than information. So, one second, y'all. There we go. So we just covered the intros. This is just the agenda that I'd like to cover today. I'm going to give you some more brief additional background information, and then we're going to get into those provisions. So, okay, so James covered the background regarding the need for Fair Chance and Housing Act beautifully. So, you know, I think it's really important to keep in mind that barriers to housing, as James noted, you know, undermines community safety, undermines family reunification because it contributes to transient living, experiencing homelessness. It is also linked to recidivism. Housing is very much the cornerstone by which we access every other thing. Schools, jobs, communities, food, public transportation, every part of civil society we access through where we live. And when we deny people stable and safe housing, we're not just cutting them off from their potential, but we're denying ourselves of their contributions. So I think that it's helpful to kind of have a human face on this issue. The New York State Fair Chance for Housing campaign produced a video that I'd like to show you a short clip of to help kind of contextualize this.
Sorry, Iris, I'm not sure that the audio is coming through for participants.
Oh, no.
At least
Well-
I'm not, maybe Josh could weigh in. I'm not hearing it correctly, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm not hearing audio either. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, y'all. This is my
That's a
first
bummer.
time having this issue. That's okay. I'll share it around later. Basically, it's two quotes from these two folks talking about their own journey to find safe and affordable housing. Chris says, I've done my time. I want to become a productive member of society. I want to reintegrate. I believe housing is very necessary and instrumental in being able to do that and being able to flourish in life. And this other quote from Felix that I find extremely moving and powerful when we hear it from him. I'll do my best. But if you have proper home, then you're part of the community. If you have a sense of belonging, you're a part of the community, actively trying to engage the community and build it. You're not destroying it. When we are included, we can actually be something as opposed to waiting to get housing. So before we move on to the nuts and bolts, if anyone has any reactions to these quotes, I invite you to drop them in the chat box. I would be interested in hearing them. All right. So it looks like we don't have any thoughts yet, which is okay. So we'll just jump to the next slide. Hopefully we'll be able to hear this video and maybe the same issue, and that'll be unfortunate. So in order to give you a better sense again of the nuts and bolts of the law, I wanted to share this brief video that DCR put together. And let's see if we could get it going. Fingers crossed.
On Juneteenth, 2021, Governor Murphy signed the Fair Chance at Housing Act, which ensures that people with past involvement in the criminal justice system have a fair shot at accessing safe and affordable housing. Nothing about the FCH.
Can you all hear that?
Yes.
No,
Wonderful.
I can hear. I can sort of hear it in the background. I can't hear it. It doesn't sound like it's coming all the way through.
Okay, let me try it again.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry for all these tech issues. Okay, let's try again.
On Juneteenth, 2021, Governor Murphy signed the Fair Chance at Housing Act, which ensures that people with past involvement in the criminal justice system have a fair shot at accessing safe and affordable housing. Nothing about the FCHA requires housing providers to consider an applicant's criminal history. Previously, a person could be denied access to housing because of a minor past offense, even when the incident didn't result in a conviction or was unrelated to whether the person would make a good neighbor or tenant. People of color bore the brunt of these policies. Due to systemic racism, Black people in New Jersey are 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. Now, the FCHA sets important limits on how housing providers can consider criminal history. Potential tenants can no longer be categorically excluded based on their criminal histories. Generally, a housing provider can only consider criminal history after making a conditional offer. Even then, they can only consider convictions for violent offenses and for other serious offenses within specified time frames. Certain records, including lists of non-resident convictions, never be considered. Housing providers must conduct an individual assessment of each prospective tenant that considers several required factors, including mitigating evidence. Throughout the process, an applicant may provide mitigating evidence, such as evidence of rehabilitation or evidence that their criminal record is inaccurate. Housing providers are required to inform applicants of all of these rights. This is a victory for all New Jerseyans. The Fair Chance at Housing Act is enforced by the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. DCR's mission is to prevent, eliminate, and remedy discrimination and bias-based harassment in employment, housing, and places of public accommodation around New Jersey. Anyone who believes their rights under the FCHA have been violated may file a complaint with DCR within 180 days of the incident. You cannot be subjected to retaliation for filing a complaint or for attempting to exercise your rights under the FCHA.
Great. So as you heard in the video, the FCHA seeks to create a fair balance between safety concerns and the rights of applicants. So to be clear, the FCHA does not require housing providers perform criminal history checks. It just simply states the process by which they should do, like that they must follow if they select to do so. So in general, as you can see on the slide, providers are not liable for actions related to not conducting these background checks. So let's break down the information presented in the video in more detail. This flow chart up here is just a helpful guide to, one second. Okay, this flow chart provides a helpful guide of everything you need to know. We'll come back to it throughout each part of the law. So to start, let's talk about who the FCHA applies to. It applies to housing providers of rental units only, except for owner-occupied dwellings of less than 4 units. And housing providers are defined extremely broadly, as you can see, as landlords, owners, lessors, sublessors, assignees, and their agents. And this is critical, or any other person receiving or entitled to receive rents or benefits for the use or occupancy of a rental dwelling. So that's extremely broad definition that I just wanted to highlight for us. So one of the main things that the FCHA does is prohibit housing providers from asking an applicant whether they have a criminal record or really anything about their criminal history at all during the initial application period. They cannot, with 2 exceptions that we'll go over in a moment, they cannot ask so verbally or in writing. And the same prohibition applies to advertisements and other notices. So if you said, you know, folks with a criminal history need not apply, that would be an automatic violation of the FCHA. So there are 2 limited exemptions that I had just mentioned. They're on the screen right here. It's actually even more limited than the screen says. So it's convictions for the manufacture or production of methamphetamine on federally subsidized lands. And also if somebody is subject to lifetime registration in the state sex offender registry. Those are the two exemptions. They're carved out in order to allow folks like public housing authorities to comply with some federal obligations. So in addition, there are certain types of criminal histories that a provider can never ask about or consider at any stage at all of the application process. This is a really important part of the law. I think it's a huge part, in fact. So they can never ask about arrests or charges that have not resulted in convictions, expunged convictions, convictions erased through executive pardon, vacated and otherwise legally nullified convictions, juvenile adjudications of delinquency, and sealed records. Previously, as some of you may know, folks were being denied housing opportunities simply because they had arrests that didn't even result necessarily in a conviction. So the FCHA also prohibits housing providers from requiring applicants to take a drug or alcohol test or to requiring them to obtain information from a treatment facility. So moving on after the initial application, as the flowchart demonstrates, a housing provider can either make someone a final offer at that point, or they can make a conditional offer, which is essentially them saying, I like everything that I've seen. We've done the screening. We just want to look into your criminal history before we make you a final offer. So here are your options. But if you provide that conditional offer, you have to provide a disclosure statement. The disclosure statement indicates whether the housing provider includes review and consideration of the applicant's criminal history. And it lays out the criteria that the housing provider uses for such review. And it praises the applicant of their right to provide evidence of inaccuracies in criminal records, rehabilitation efforts, or other mitigating circumstances. And the housing provider may not accept an application fee until they provide this disclosure statement. So DCR has created this model disclosure statement. This is just a link, the first page of it. You can find it on our website. This model disclosure statement includes all the things that are required of a disclosure statement. So I'm trying to drop the link for you all, but again, I'm having these tech issues today, so I'm not able to. We could circulate them around later. You could just use this model disclosure statement. You need not use it. You can create your own, but yours has to comply with the regulations and law. So after a housing provider has made a conditional offer, the law states that they can only consider specific types of convictions in determining whether or not to make a final offer. There is an extremely narrow list of violent offenses that could be considered from any time period, and then a look back list of offenses that could be considered within certain time periods. So for any time period, they can look at these offenses that are up on the screen: murder, aggravated assault, kidnapping, endangering the welfare of a child in violation of that statute there, arson, human trafficking, sexual assault, any crime that resulted in a lifetime registration in a state sex offender registry. And then these are the look back periods for the other offenses. So a conviction for first degree indictable offense, you can look back 6 years. Second and third degree offenses, past 4 years, and fourth degree indictable offenses, past year. So I understand, as James noted, that is a lot for housing providers to kind of grapple with. And because of that, we created some materials to help you. So if you go to our website, again, I will circulate a link. We have a section called Guidance on Interpreting Criminal Offenses under the FCHA. And there you'll find 2 links. One is to a chart that lists all of the offenses under the New Jersey Criminal Code and their degrees. And the other is a link to a law that explains New Jersey's classification of criminal offenses committed in other states or under federal law. Because here in New Jersey, we call those offenses something different than they're called in other laws. So that will help you navigate that. But like in general, let's go back. In general, as you can see, the more serious the offense, the longer the look back period, right? So let's give you an example. It's a direct violation of the Fair Chance in Housing Act for a provider to reject an applicant based on an offense that does not fall within the categories we just reviewed, or that is beyond the time frame. So for example, if a housing provider were to reject an applicant because of a conviction for 4th-degree assault that happened 3 years ago, that would violate the Fair Chance in Housing Act, because as you can see on the slide, you can only look back 1 year for 4th-degree offenses. So if you're a housing provider, you might work with an outside screening agency to conduct background checks. So in this case, the law says that you must take, quote, reasonable steps to ensure that the third party is in compliance with the law, or you could be liable for violations. So ideally, if you select to perform a background check, a housing provider should provide the screening agency with what can be considered under the law. So the specific allowable convictions and the timeframes for each conviction, and ask the agency to only run a report that includes those specific convictions. If the agency is not able to do that or fails to do that and reports information that goes beyond what is allowable under the Act, the housing provider must only consider the types of convictions that are allowable under the Act. If there is a complaint, the burden will be on the housing provider to show that they didn't rely on any records prohibited under the law. So the Fair Chance in Housing Act allows applicants to present evidence throughout all stages of the application process of inaccuracies in their criminal record, and also of other mitigating information. And housing providers have an obligation to take that information into account so that they do not rely on incorrect information, particularly with regards to background reports, which we know often contain inaccurate information. So if the background check doesn't reveal one of the listed convictions that we just covered, the housing provider must make a final offer as shown in this flow chart. If one of the listed convictions appears within the allowable time frame, the housing provider may withdraw the offer, but only if the withdrawal is necessary to fulfill a substantial, legitimate, and non-discriminatory interest. Again, only if it's necessary to fulfill a substantial, legitimate, and non-discriminatory interest. So if the provider selects not to make the final offer and to withdraw the offer, they must provide a notice of withdrawal. This is also a screenshot of the model notice of withdrawal you can find on our DCR website. So the notice, again, you can use a notice or use your own, but you have to be sure that yours complies with the law, and our notice complies with the law. It's a template that is available to help you. So the notice must include an individualized analysis explaining the specific reasons that someone's criminal history disqualifies them from being a tenant in that property. So for example, if an applicant has a conviction for arson, just as an example, the provider must state on the notice that they are concerned that if the applicant repeated the offense, they would cause damage to the building or harm other tenants. So it has to be quite specific. And there are certain factors that you are required to take into account. It's on our model disclosure form. The factors are the nature and severity of the offense, the applicant's age at the time of the offense, how recently that offense occurred, any materials the applicant has provided in their favor, and if the offense were to happen again, if it would impact other tenants or the property, and whether or not the offense was even connected to the underlying offense was even connected to property at all. So for the arson example, right, the outcome may look different if the arson occurred when the person was 18 and now they're 60 and it was a one-time offense. Obviously, the look back wouldn't permit that, but I'm just giving it as an example. And the offense wasn't tied to the property and the person has since undergone some kind of treatment. So an important provision in the law is that just having a certain type of offense on a criminal record is not enough in of itself for a provider to withdraw an offer. For example, a provider can't say, hey, I'm withdrawing the offer because you committed arson. That's insufficient. It needs to be an individualized assessment. Similarly, it wouldn't be okay to say I'm withdrawing the offer because you committed a second-degree offense in the last 3 years. Again, individualized, specific, non-discriminatory reason for the decision. So I'm going to go ahead again and drop a link to this when I'm done here. So once the applicant receives a notice of withdrawal, they have 30 days to request a copy of all the information the housing provider relied on in considering the application, including the criminal records, if that was part of the consideration. And the housing provider in turn has 10 days from that request to share the documents free of cost. The applicant must also be informed of their right to appeal a decision. That's going to be right within the notice of withdrawal. If the applicant chooses to do so, they may submit evidence that their criminal record was inaccurate, evidence of rehabilitation or good conduct, or other mitigating factors. And a housing provider has 30 days to consider the appeal and respond to that applicant. So, for example, these are just some potential things that an applicant may share to show mitigating circumstances. A certificate of a relief from disabilities or a certificate of good conduct, letter from parole or probation officer, letter from previous landlord saying this is a great tenant, we haven't had any issues, letter from folks in the community. And if the person selects to provide it, they can provide proof of counseling, social service, drug rehabilitation, and a number of other things. These are just some examples. So we're almost done here. The last part for us to go over tracks with 4 and 5 of the flow chart. So, and if the applicant is satisfied with the provider's determination, the process ends there as shown by the flow chart. If the applicant believes that the FCHA was violated, they may file a complaint with DCR. They have 180 days to do so using our online portal, NJ Bias, bias.njcivilrights.gov. And the law requires that DCR first offers an opportunity for mediation for the respondent, meaning, of course, here the housing provider. There we go. DCR will make a good faith effort to contact the provider within 14 days of receiving a complaint and offer them an opportunity to resolve matters through informal mediation process. This could be a simple phone call, it could be a meeting. If the situation can be resolved this way, an agreement can be drafted and the case can be closed, as shown in the flow chart. If the provider chooses not to go through the mediation, DCR may investigate the complaint. If DCR determines that the housing provider violated the law requires the following tiered penalty system. As you can see, 1,000 for first violation within the last 5 years, 5,000 for a second within the last 5, 10 for a third violation with the last 7. If you have multiple kind of, for example, postings out there with language that violates the law, each one would consist of a separate violation. So I encourage you all, this was a very truncated version. of the training in order to fit our needs today. I encourage you all to attend that DCR training. If you have any questions, you can also contact us. That is our website for FCHA matters, FCHA info at njcivilrights.gov. You can alert us if you don't want to file a complaint. I know you all are housing providers, but you may see things that you want us to address. You can alert us to it through that website, and you need not necessarily get involved. That's one way that we're available, but we're also available to answer questions. I know that today we covered a lot of material very quickly. And so if you have any questions, I encourage you to reach out. I'm monitoring it. It may take some time, but I will get back to you. And also we have that training that I had mentioned. We have one coming up in about, I think, 2 weeks. I encourage you to sign up for that as well. It's a far more detailed training. It also kind of goes into some of the disparities in our systems that led us to need the FCHA. So that's it. I thank you all for your time today. And I am gonna take a look and see if there are any questions. Oh, here's another poll. I gave you the answer in advance, but in the United States, do more people have a criminal record or a college degree? So I guess we'll see if folks are listening. And this number, by the way, y'all, comes from the a Brennan Center report. In the meantime, I see that there was a question about what happens when the apartment is gone. Look, if the apartment is still available as part of the mediation process, that could be a solution to house somebody. If the apartment is gone, it's very fact sensitive. You know, if you're a big provider, you may have another apartment, you may be able to solve something during the mediation period, right? The real issue is whether or not there'll be a violation will be found, right? And if you can settle it before it gets to that during the mediation process, that is certainly a way for things to go forward. Do I know, so this other question, I don't know if everyone can see the screen, so I'll just read it. Do you know the reasoning behind why the law does not apply to occupied dwellings of less than 4 units? So, you know, I was not as involved. I came into DCR in later stages here. However, I will say that it's quite common for there to be exceptions in housing laws for small landlords, folks that live inside the building, right? So that exemption is if somebody lives in the building that they own. Sometimes they're called Murphy laws. It's a kind of common carve out. Okay, so we got this answer here to the college degree question. More people have a criminal record than college degree, 40%. More people have a college degree. So about 50%. So it's about the same number, or at least it was at the time of the Brennan report that we pulled that question from. I'm just kind of working through some of these questions. Is that helpful now, Josh?
Yeah, I think so, and I can maybe even pose a few myself. I think we have plenty of time. I think we're gonna go until I don't remember if it was 11 or may have been sent out until 11:30, but we have plenty of time to do some questions. So why don't we? I'll invite James back, and we can run through some questions, have a little discussion, And if anybody has any questions, if you feel free to put them into the Q&A. I guess the first thing that I would sort of pose to, and I think I'll throw this one to James, just sort of speaking to, you know, the necessity of such a bill like the Fair Chance in Housing Act. In you know, the group that we're sort of talking with today is a group, as we know, is the Affordable Housing Professionals of New Jersey. These are folks who are responsible for, administer, administrative agents, municipal housing liaisons, those sorts of folks who are responsible for administering deed restricted affordable housing units in New Jersey. And I guess, James, I would ask if you could just sort of speak to, you talked about intersectionality at the beginning of your discussion. If you could talk a little bit about sort of the intersectionality of the necessity for something like the Mount Laurel Doctrine and the need for additional, you know, affordable housing units and ending exclusion, and the need for a bill such as the Fair Chance in Housing Act.
Sure. So just to, you know, briefly talk about Mount Laurel, it was probably, I mean, it's New Jersey's historic gentrification case, right? So an elderly Black woman was being pushed out of her home in Mount Laurel. And when our founder, Peter O'Connor, and the matriarch of our organization, Ethel Lawrence, worked in conjunction with Camden NAACP, Southern Burlington County, and other advocates, the goal was to provide them an opportunity to remain within their respective communities. New Jersey has not done a good job of the issue of race. And this was one of the first pivotal kind of seminal cases around race and housing as an intersectional point. So when that case was litigated, a lot of people don't know, and our founder, Peter, often tells us, kind of as a historical note, the case was originally tried on the premise of race, not economics, which it was originally decided on, but he originally wanted to try the case on race. That got shot down. He re-engaged on the component of economic discrimination, and here we have the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which all of you know requires municipalities in the state of New Jersey to provide affordable housing. And I want to give a big shout out. Josh and I, you know, we don't get to interact. I started shortly before COVID, but he's the guy that goes out and makes that happen. He's for those of you that know him, he's a tenacious litigator, and he makes a lot of the work that I'm able to do very possible. So when we think about Mount Laurel as a continuum and how we move it along, Josh is litigating the building of the units. The next step is to ensure the appropriate access to the units. So now we have to reduce this societal barriers that are stopping Black and brown and marginalized communities, low income communities, from having access to quality housing. So we go there, and then the next piece is creating the actual communities in which these individuals will thrive. I had the opportunity to hear venture capitalist Robert Smith at a convention speak, and he almost to a T described Mount Laurel. He talked about how he was bused from his low to moderate income neighborhood to a more affluent neighborhood to go to school. And from that school, he got an internship that provided him the opportunity to be mentored by a young man that went to Cornell, and the rest is history. So one opportunity turned him from a low to moderate income individual that lived in a small suburb of Colorado to the richest African-American man in the country right now. And that, to his credit, he says, came from that educational opportunity that he would have not been provided if he would have maintained and stayed in that low to moderate income that he historically lived. So that, to me, is such a telling story about potential. Will we all become billionaires? Probably not. Our hope is that, we'll get there one day. But if not, even if somewhere along that bell curve, we're somewhere in between, where we are now and billionaire, That's great progress. That's great progress. That's generationally changing progress. So as we think about how we continue to build the units are coming online. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have 70,000 units that are coming online. And then from there, with the help of DCR, we have to ensure that whether it's eviction filings, credit, source of lawful income, criminal background check, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, whatever the case may be, we have to ensure that the right people then have access to those units. And then the next phase of that will be building and providing the resources in those communities to allow these individuals to reach their best potential. So I look at this bill as an intersectional bill because it did something that one of our partners at the Institute for Social Justice, it decoupled the criminal background system with democracy. Because up until a couple of years ago, formerly incarcerated people didn't have the right to vote. That's a fundamental right, and that was taken away. So now we're decoupling housing, which we believe is a fundamental right, from the criminal justice system. So if we decouple that, we allow people to actually have access to what this country truly has to offer. And once again, I'm very biased that housing to me is at the epicenter of what you need to actually do great work in this country. It showed us during COVID, before masks, before vaccines, your home is where we were told to shelter in place. Your home was the safest place that you could be to be healthy and for you to live and to keep your family alive. Then the other components came along. So before masks, before vaccines, we were all told to shelter in place. And if you didn't have shelter, what were you left to do? A lot of our vulnerable population saw rampant amounts of COVID go through their communities. We saw, formerly incarcerated people, homeless, veterans, a lot of the Black and Brown communities that have multi-generational homes where you find grandparents, parents, and grandchildren all living in one home, not because of, that is a cultural dynamic that exists within, but also because they found it difficult to find access to housing. So I'll stop there, but our work is to create this linear progress from building the units, providing access, and then creating the communities for these individuals to thrive.
Thank you, James. As always, I give a little prompt and you give us a wealth of passion and information. I really appreciate that. And just promise that if you ever do become a billionaire, you'll help me pay off my student loans at some point. Okay. Why don't we go back to the Q&A? I think we do have some specific questions. So anonymous attendee asks, is the applicable time frame from the event, the conviction, or some other time? And I'll throw that to Iris.
Yeah, so in our model, notice if you take a look, it says from the conviction or the release from prison. I think it's an area like in a new law that we're going to see how it shakes out.
Okay, we got some more questions coming in. Well, one thing that I did want to sort of ask Iris to speak to is, so as I said before, many of the folks who are in the audience are folks who are administrative agents, municipal housing liaisons, maybe some attorneys who may be working with developers and landlords. Can you just give a little bit more to, so the role of an administrative agent is somebody who is kind of like a third party who is sort of interacting with both the potential tenant and also with the actual owner of the affordable housing unit that is being offered for rent. And I was just curious if you could offer any additional insights specific to sort of those folks as they try to figure out what it is that they're supposed to do, especially with respect to the the owners of the properties.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they have, in the same way that the owner of the property would have to follow the Fair Chance and Housing Act, those folks would have to as well. It applies, they could be, if they're acting as the agent of the landlord for sure. And also it applies to anybody who's receiving any benefits tied to rent. So that could be a pretty broad definition, right? So best practice is to kind of get comfortable with all these concepts, to pull up our model notices that will hopefully help guide you, and to, you know, follow the steps that we covered today.
Great. We also have if you have the Q&A open, there's a question about the carve out on production of methamphetamines in public housing. Was wondering if one of you had a reaction to that.
Well, I can kind of contextualize it a little bit, right? It's not that the law says that you can never consider production, right? It's that there are two exemptions to the law. There are two places where a landlord up front can say, we're not going to even look at you, right? And those are the two carve outs. So it's not that later on in the process, if you have a conviction and it's a certain degree within a certain time period, they can't consider it. It is just that it cannot be a bar. In terms of talking about, in terms of meth production that's not tied to federally subsidized buildings.
Right. And I think that's the biggest, you know, that's the biggest area of clarity, that, you know, federally subsidized housing, this does not supersede those regulations. So the production of meth, we are, you know, hopefully working with HUD to really start to have conversations about them addressing their criminal background check components and how they look at those types of crimes. But this does not supersede that. So as it pertains to meth, and you know, thinking about that, and also like Megan's Law, like we didn't touch Megan's Law, like those components are still in place. So there's some aspects of this bill that still are in place and operate outside of the law. So those are just, to Iris's point, just federally subsidized places, but anything else that would be up to the landlord or developer's discretion.
Let's keep going here. So another question, can you touch on homeless vets a little bit? Does this bill apply to them as well, regardless of race?
I'm sorry, I think you just cut out for a second. So I'm gonna maybe see if I could see the homeless vets a bit. Does this bill apply to them regardless of race? So this bill, this law applies to anybody who is seeking to rent an apartment with a criminal history. They're protected, right? It's not tied to a specific category, like protected category under the law against discrimination. It's simply tied to criminal background check, like criminal history. We know that criminal history is often in our country used as a proxy for other things and a way to keep people of color out of housing opportunities. But that's not to say that the bill only addresses race-based denials. Oh, and I see that we have a question up. So as we're kind of talking about housing and access to equal access to housing opportunities for people of color, which state has the highest racial disparity rate? It just popped up on one of our polls. So your options are California, Florida, New Jersey, and Idaho.
We'll give folks a second to answer that, and then we can go back to the Q&A. There's another question about application fees and what folks can charge, and depending on the conditional offer and that sort of stuff. If you guys can take a look at that question.
Yeah, sure. So can landlord charge an application fee? So the law says that you cannot charge an application fee until that conditional offer is made. If you're making a final offer, I guess at that point, if you're not doing the conditional offer, you might be able to, but it's when you make the conditional offer. So that's going to be after you do that screening, right? Presumably. And by that screening, let me clarify, after the credit screening, right? Because you've already looked at things and now you're making a conditional offer.
Great. So I don't see any more questions here. I'm going to give it another minute, just if anybody has any specific questions on for the panelists. I'm not seeing any coming in. So I think we can sort of wind this thing up. If you guys have, either of you have any sort of final thoughts or anything else you'd like to share, and then we can sort of get to wrapping up.
Some folks did ask if the PowerPoints would be available afterwards. So if the presenters are willing and able to share those with me after the meeting, then I can share them with participants.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to share this specific PowerPoint, but I have another PowerPoint that I could share that's in more detail, and I'll do so.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So I guess I would just say, first of all, thank you for having us. And I'm sorry for our tech issues. I really wish you could have seen some of those videos. But I am really happy to have so many people here that care about this, that want to get it right. You know, I know when there's a new law, sometimes there's a learning curve, and it's really important to get all the information out there. So I thank you for this opportunity. Also very much, I think that this is a human rights issue. And it's important to think of that as we kind of grapple with and work with the law as well.
Great, thank you, Iris, and thanks for taking the time to come and offer some explanations on this. It's obviously a big deal and a big change in the law, and I think you mentioned before that there probably is going to be a little bit of a learning curve and a little bit of trying to make sure folks are getting their tenant selection procedures in place so they conform with the law, and it has its. Oh wait a second. There's more. There's another question. I'm gonna open up for one more question. If somebody does not meet the criteria during credit check, then no conditional offer is made, so nothing else needs to be done. Is that? I guess it's not really a question as much as a statement. So, so I'm gonna wrap up unless you have anything else. I think we're done. I don't know what else we need to do, Lindsay.
So when I end the webinar, there will be a survey on your screen. Please complete the survey before you close out your browser window. And this webinar has been recorded. AHP&J typically is able to post the webinars on our website in the near future. So if you have someone else who's interested in viewing the information, then that's where you can tell them to look. It usually takes a couple of weeks.
Great, and I have one more thing I just forgot to mention. Throughout the PowerPoint, I referenced documents on the DCR website. I really, really encourage you all to go through those documents. As I do more of these trainings and we're out there in the community and we hear more from housing providers and also housing rights orgs and tenants and everyone across the board, it influences the materials that I put out, right? Like it lets me know if there are things that you all need. And we definitely have intention of updating that website and making more materials available. So periodically check in on it.
And Iris, I while you were talking, I sent links to the website and to the Flowchart and some of the other things out while you were talking. So everybody should have those, and they're in the chat. So everybody should have that at this point. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Remember, you got to take the poll at the end, and I think that's it. I think we're done. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you at the next AHP&J panel. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.